On Christmas Eve, 1914, headquarters issued a warning to the British Expeditionary Forces, quote, "It is thought possible that the enemy may be contemplating an attack during Christmas or New Year. Special vigilance will be maintained during these periods," end quote. Now, there had been sporadic fighting along the line on the 24th, but as night fell, in most places, it grew quiet. The weather got colder. The soggy ground here began to freeze. And here in the dark, as British soldiers sat talking quietly in their trenches, just across that short, deadly space of no man's land, they heard words they didn't recognize, but a tune that was unmistakable. Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht, alle schläft, einsam wacht. Cautious heads popped up above the British trenches and then back down again, but no shots rang out. Heads popped up again to take a longer look. Some of the Brits began to join in, singing the same tune, but in English. Round yon virgin mother and child, holy infant so tender and mild. After the singing came a round of applause and happy laughter from both sides of the battlefield. Sleep in heavenly peace, sleep in heavenly peace. British machine gunner Bruce Bairnsfather, who was later a prominent cartoonist, wrote about this incident in his memoirs. Like most of his fellow infantrymen of the 1st Battalion of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment, he was spending the holiday evening shivering in the muck, trying to keep warm. He had spent a good part of the last few months fighting against the Germans, and now, in a part of the Ypres salient called the Bois de Ploegsteert, an area the British called Plug Street Wood, Bairnsfather was crouched in a trench that stretched just 3 feet deep by 3 feet wide. He wrote about it and he said this, quote, "Here I was in this horrible clay cavity, miles and miles from home, cold, wet through, and covered with mud. There didn't seem the slightest chance of leaving, except in an ambulance," end quote. Bairnsfather wrote about the singing that began in the early evening, and then he wrote about what happened next. He said, "Suddenly, we heard a confused shouting from the other side. We all stopped to listen. The shout came again. The voice was from an enemy soldier speaking in English with a strong German accent. He was saying, 'Come over here, come over here.' One of our British sergeants answered, 'You come halfway, I come halfway.'" Now, what happened next would become a part of the lore of the Great War for all time. Enemy soldiers began to climb nervously out of their trenches and to meet in the barbed wire no man's land that separated the armies. There were handshakes, there were words of kindness, there were exchanges of gifts. The soldiers traded songs, tobacco, alcohol. They joined in a spontaneous Christmas Eve party in the cold night. Bairnsfather couldn't believe what he was seeing. He said, quote, "Here they were, the actual, practical soldiers of the German army. There was not an atom of hate on either side. Just think Oswald Tilley of the London Rifle Brigade wrote to his family, "While you were eating turkey, I was talking and shaking hands with the very men I had been trying to kill a few hours before." It was astounding. Now, there had been sporadic truces in the weeks preceding Christmas Eve, but nothing like what happened on this evening and all the next day on this part of the line. It was spontaneous, and in some cases, it lasted for a week or more. A number of the accounts of the Christmas truces from both sides involve stories of football. In most cases, it was just a kickabout, but in at least a few situations, they describe actual organized matches. Now, we don't know how much that really happened, but in a few cases, they even record the score. One British soldier named Ernie Williams described in an interview what he remembered about that. He said, quote, "The ball appeared from somewhere, I don't know where. They made up some goals, and one fellow went in goal, and then it was just a general kickabout. I should think there were about a couple of 100 taking part," end quote. Now on the German side, Lieutenant Kurt Zemschik of the 134th Saxons Infantry, who was a school teacher who spoke both English and German, also described a pickup game in his diary. That diary was discovered in an attic near Leipzig in 1999. And he said, quote, "Eventually the English brought a football from their trenches, and pretty soon a lively game ensued. How marvelously wonderful, yet how strange it was. The English officers felt the same way about it. Thus Christmas, the celebration of love, managed to bring mortal enemies together as friends for a time," end quote. So seeing this setup here, it's great for a visual, seeing what the German trenches would have looked like on this side and seeing what the British trenches might have looked like on that side, and with the football memorial in the center and no man's land running down between. It's a great visual, but it's important to point out this is not at all accurate as far as where the lines were. This is not where this Christmas truce happened. We are well behind British lines. That's why these cemeteries, you see the two cemeteries, and then there's two more back there in that direction. No man's land was actually over here. And the British lines would have run probably right about where that tree is, would have been where the British frontline trenches were. And then far on the other side, maybe perhaps where those buildings are, is where the German lines would have been. And the account that we have from Bruce Bairnsfather talking about the Christmas truce, he drew a map of this whole area and exactly where things happened. And he told us in that map that his encounter with a German soldier on Christmas during the truce was over in that direction. The British lines went down that way, I don't know, maybe another half mile or so, and then they curved around well on the other side of the village here. And it was somewhere over in that direction is where he would have had his encounter on Christmas with the Germans. And so if we're talking about a Christmas truce at this site, we're probably talking about maybe 200-300 yards in that direction in this field in front of us. Now, it wasn't all just singing, drinking, smoking, and football. In many of these places, there were dead from both sides who still were lying in no man's land. There are multiple reports of joint burial services held in both German and in English as they gave proper burials to men who just hours earlier had been shooting at and killing one another. In at least one place, the truce is known to have lasted through to the new year. A member of the London Regiment who served as a translator wrote about an incident that he experienced on New Year's Eve. He said that a runner came up to him and said, "Hey, there's a drunk German in our trenches and he won't go back to his own lines." And so the translator, he wrote, "So I went up and saw our platoon officer and he said, 'Williams, there's this chap here, he's drunk. I don't mind, it's all very well to meet him in no man's land, but he's actually in our trenches.' Anyway, this chap was standing there with a couple of bottles of beer, wanting us to drink the health of the new year and all the rest of it. He said, 'Tell him he's got to go back.' So I told him. He wouldn't take any notice. He didn't want to go back. And this officer said, 'Well, if he stops here, he's got to be made a prisoner. Ask him if he wants to be made a prisoner.' So I did. 'Oh, was? Gott, nein,' he said. He understood that, but he wouldn't go back. Eventually, the officer detailed another chap and me to take him back, so he was escorted to his own lines, one on each side, and this chap staggering about, singing at the top of his voice. Well, we got up to the German wire, and I thought, well, I don't think I'll go right into their trenches. They may not be as lenient as we are. Anyway, we found a gap in the wire, headed him in the right direction, and left him to it. It's fair to say the high command on both sides were not happy about these spontaneous truces. One British soldier recalled how they put a stop to it. He said, "We got orders, come down the trench, get back in your trenches, every man, by word of mouth, down each trench. Everybody back in your trenches," shouting. The generals behind must have seen it and got a bit suspicious. So what they did, they gave orders for a battery of guns behind us to fire, and a machine gun to open out, and officers to fire their revolvers at the Jerrys. Of course, that started the war again. Ooh, we were cursing them to hell, cursing the generals and that. You want to get up here in this stuff? Never mind you're giving orders in your big chateau and you're driving about in your big cars. We hated the sight of the bloody generals. Now, it's important to note that these truces, they didn't happen everywhere along the lines. There's one story told by an angry British soldier who had a friend he had lost just that very afternoon. And so he started shooting at the candles and the Christmas trees that the Germans were setting up above their trenches as they appeared. In many places, the war never stopped. And in future years, officers on both sides took steps to make sure that the Christmas Truce of 1914 would never be repeated. But for many of the men here on the front lines of the war to end all wars, at least for one day, there was indeed peace on earth and goodwill to men.
Ein Briter kommt! Ein Briter kommt!
Jim?
Jim, don't do it!
Halt! Er ist nicht bewaffnet! Nein, Otto!
Jim!
My name is Jim.
Mein Name ist Otto.
Pleased to meet you, Otto.
Freut mich.
Rose, she's called.
Sie ist schön. Schön. Danke.
Happy Christmas.
Frohe Weihnachten.